Hello everyone, I am Bastien Gebel, a 22 years old student in Master of Science and Politics of Environment. This video was produced for educational purposes, as part of a class on the European Green Deal, a class of C.CharveriatSc-Po's PSIA, in which I took part in fall 2022. I chose to introduce the European Emission trading scheme for this video in order to learn more about an essential element of European environmental policy that I knew very little about. Have you ever heard of the European ETS? Do you know about its importance for the environmental strategy of the EU as an essential tool of the EU Green Deal? No? Do not worry, you clicked on the right video to know everything you need about it. So after a general presentation, we will discuss the principle of cap and trade on which the European ETS is based. We will then talk about the different phases of implementation before focusing on the current phase, which is part of the European Green Deal. We will conclude by exploring the internationalization potential of the European ETS. So the EU ETS is the European trading scheme for emissions, which is the economic framework set by the EU so that companies can trade carbon with each other. It is the first large trading scheme on greenhouse gas emissions worldwide and is one of the major measures of the European environment and energy policy that aims to tackle climate change by reducing progressively EU's emissions. But how does the EU ETS concretely work? The EU ETS works on the cap and trade principle. This means that a cap is set on the total amount of certain greenhouse gases that can be emitted by the installations covered by the system. The cap is then reduced over time for the total emissions to fall. Within the cap, installations either receive free allowances or buy them at auction. They can then trade with one another as needed. The ratio between the number of allowances available on the market and the demand drives the emission abatement efficiency. After each year, an installation must surrender enough allowances to cover fully its emissions. Otherwise, heavy fines are imposed. The fine is €100 per excess ton for the EU ETS. If an installation emits less than its allowances permit, it can keep the spare allowances to cover its future needs, or else sell them to another installation that is short of allowances. But you may ask, why did the EU choose a cap and trade system? Because the advantage of such an economic system based on trading is, in theory at least, that emissions are cut where it costs least to do so. On the other hand, the big drawback of this system is that its efficiency is based on a good choice of the cap to be set each year, which supposes a very good knowledge of the annual emissions of each member state. And this has played tricks to the EU, as we will see in a moment. Now that you know how the EU ETS works, let's see if the system worked when it has been implemented. In the first phase, that started in 2005, and that was meant to test the efficiency of the scheme, the EU ETS included some 12,000 installations, representing approximately 40% of EU CO2 emissions. This phase has been an absolute failure due to an over-evaluation of the CO2 emissions of the member states. This led to setting a cap way above the total CO2 emissions, and so the prices of the allowances dropped to near zero after less than a year. But the EU, with the lessons learned from the first phase, decided to implement new rules to better its ETS and launched two new phases between 2008 and 2020. Among the most impactful rules there are the tightening of the cap to have more scarcity in the allowances and hence both a higher price of carbon and a lower probability of having caps that actually exceed the actual emission of the member states, like in phase 1. Second, the auctioning part of the allowances instead of giving them for free to lower the cost of the ETS for the EU. And last, the inclusion of more economic sectors in the ETS and considering more gases as sources of emissions to improve the impact of the ETS. So did it work this time? Yes, despite a still low price of carbon, installations covered by the EU ETS reduced emissions by about 35% between 2005 and 2019. Hence, the ETS system showed real efficiency in the reduction of the European CO2 emissions. Now, what changed in 2020? The main difference is that the EU ETS has been included in a wider strategy, the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is an ambitious set of policy initiatives by the European Commission that aims to make Europe climate neutral in 2050. One of the key policies of this deal, called the Fit for 55 package, is targeting a 55% reduction of greenhouse gases emissions for 2030 compared to 1990 level. This policy has the EU ETS as its main tool. Indeed, the idea would be to use the knowledge acquired during the first phases of implementation of the EU ETS to progressively reduce the CO2 emissions of the most polluting European industries. In concrete terms, a controlled increase in the scarcity of allowances would make it possible to increase the price of European carbon and thus encourage companies to reduce their emissions. But the EU ETS will not be used alone in the fight against greenhouse gas emissions. Indeed, a major criticism of the EU ETS is the risk of carbon leakage, meaning the import into the European Union of highly polluting products for which producers have not paid the European carbon price. This would result in a major break on the global effectiveness of the European ecological strategy, as well as a major drop in the competitiveness of European companies. That is why, in the framework of the European Green Deal, the EU ETS will be coupled with a carbon border adjustment mechanism from 2023. This mechanism is precisely intended to impose its carbon price to companies which would like to trade goods that are part of the EU ETS program but that don't pay any carbon price in their home country. Let's now try to extend our vision. As the environmental questions can just be solved locally, one might ask if the EU ETS has any potential of having an international dimension. And the answer is yes, in two different ways at least. First, Europe can help other countries with its experience to develop and implement a national ETS. For example, between 2014 and 2017, the European Commission, in close cooperation with China, carried out a 3-year project to support the design and the implementation of emissions trading in China. This helped China releasing the first version of its ETS in 2021. To increase international cooperation on this issue, the EU also created an open forum, the International Carbon Action Partnership. Second, the EU ETS could link with other existing cap and trade systems, as it has been done with Switzerland in 2020. Beyond the global leadership of the EU in this area that these links would reflect, there are significant advantages for other countries to link to a market the size of the EU ETS, including the reduction of the cost of cutting emissions and the stability of the carbon price. This could therefore be a strategy to include small countries with low emissions and whose national carbon markets would be too fragile to exist on their own. Okay, so let's sum up what we've learned in this video. The EU ETS is a cap and trade system where companies of the most polluting sectors trade allowances to pollute, and that aims to reduce the emissions of the EU. After a first failure, the EU succeeded in reducing the emissions of the targeted sectors of 35% over 15 years using its ETS. Since 2020, the EU ETS is an essential tool of a bigger strategy, the European Green Deal, and will be coupled from 2023 with a tool that ensures its efficiency and viability, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Finally, the EU ETS contributes also to making the EU a key international environmental player and gives it the credibility it needs to help other players follow its example towards a more sustainable future. Thank you for your attention. And just to remind you that everything that was discussed in this presentation is aimed to achieve net zero emissions in 2050, which is, in my opinion, a crucial goal for the common good. And here are the sources used for this presentation in case you want to know more.